Today's lesson is War Correspondence, the Eyes and Ears of War. Hello, I'm Helen.
I'm Roger.
And today we're going to talk about a subject that's quite serious. It has to do with war, and it has to do not with soldiers or people who actually fight the war, but people who are actually considered just as heroic. We're talking about correspondents, and they are the eyes and ears of war.
Right, of course, a correspondent in this particular case is just referring to a news reporter, a journalist going to areas where wars are being fought, and they go there and they get stories, they take pictures, they take videos, they interview people, etc., etc. They are war correspondents, and again, they are the eyes and ears of war. If we want to know what's happening with a certain war that's going on in the world, like in Ukraine, for example, we depend on those war correspondents to give us that information. So let's begin our lesson right now by listening to the first part, and we'll come right back.
War correspondents, the eyes and ears of war. The first casualty of war is the truth, or so the old saying goes. However, one group of professionals make it their mission to protect the truth from the ravages of war. Extraordinarily brave, war correspondents report the realities of conflict, even as bullets fly and bombs drop around them.
大家好，我们来看标题中的单字 correspondent， 它是名词，意思是记者或是通讯员。例如The correspondent traveled to Japan to cover an important story. 该记者前往日本报道一个重要的事件。又或者说 The news correspondent reported live from the scene of the earthquake. 该新闻记者在地震现场及时报道。接下来我们来介绍名词 ravage. 它的意思是严重损坏或是毁坏。例如 A plague of locusts caused a great ravage to the farmland. 一场蝗灾对农田造成了严重的破坏。又或者是 It's not easy for local residents to recover from the ravage of the tornado. 当地居民要从龙卷风的破坏中恢复过来并不容易。另外这个字也可以当作动词使用，意思是摧残、蹂躏、毁灭或是肆虐。例如 The storm ravaged the coast and many homes were lost. 暴风雨摧残那个海湾，许多住家损毁。又或者说 The pandemic has ravaged most countries in the world. 这场疫情大流行肆虐全球大多数国家。
The first casualty of war is the truth, or so the old saying goes. So here we have a saying, and the saying, within quotes, is the first casualty of war is the truth. So casualty here is a person or a thing that suffers badly as a result of an event or a situation. So often we use the phrase casualty of war to talk about people who died or who suffered badly in the war. And usually it refers to soldiers or civilians, people who caught in the middle of the fight.
Right, so when you're injured or killed, you are a casualty. And of course, we talk about the first casualty of war being the truth. And yes, indeed, they do try to tell the truth, but eventually they kind of lose the ability to be objective, and we get different kinds of information, and those bits of information sometimes conflict with each other. And we continue on. It says, however, one group of professionals make it their mission to protect the truth from the ravages of war. A professional, of course, is somebody who works in a job that you had to receive a lot of professional training for, like going to university and getting certain degrees. And if you're a correspondent, if you're a journalist, of course, you are a professional. You get paid to do that. And these professionals make it their mission to protect the truth from the ravages of war. So if you make something your mission, that means it's very important to you. Perhaps it's the most important part of your job.
Yes, so for these correspondents, the most important part of their job is to protect the truth from the ravages of war. Ravages here refers to damages, so it's another word for damages. And you often hear the phrase ravages of war. You may also hear ravages of time because because time can also destroy things. With the passage of time, buildings get older, houses fall apart, cars. So time can also ravage things, can also damage things. You can also say ravages of the weather. So if a typhoon comes in and destroys everything in its path, then you can say that these things are the ravages of the typhoon. Now, the correspondents have the mission to protect truth from being destroyed by the war, protecting truth from becoming the ravages of war.
Right, so of course, war involves a lot of pain and suffering and death and destruction. So, of course, sometimes it's difficult to report objectively about what is happening with the war. But correspondents, of course, want to protect the truth, even though the war is quite violent and extraordinarily brave, or extraordinarily brave, I should say. War correspondents report the realities of conflict, even as bullets fly and bombs drop around them. So these are extraordinarily brave people. They are war correspondents. They're extremely brave. Of course, if you're going into a war zone like Ukraine or Syria, of course, you're going to be in a lot of trouble there. It's going to be a very dangerous situation, but they still need to report the realities of that conflict, even as bullets fly and bombs drop around them. So even as means they have to do this despite the circumstances. It's very violent, but they still need to report the truth.
Right, so these people are very brave because they put themselves in danger by being in the midst of war, and they report the realities of the conflict because without the reports, people sitting at home may not know the reality of the war, of how cruel and violent it is and how many people have died because no one is there to tell them what's actually happening. So the realities of the conflict are being reported by these correspondents even as bullets fly and bombs drop around them. So here, even as can also mean at the very same moment or in the same way that something else is happening. So you can also say, I was walking down the street, enjoying myself even as the rain came down and the weather was really cold.
Right. Sometimes a rainy day can be quite fun, but most people kind of hate it because it's very inconvenient. But again, if you're covering a war, if you are a war correspondent, you need to report the realities of the conflict, even as those bullets are flying past your head, and you might even get killed yourself. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's listen now to the second part.
The roots of this noble profession go back thousands of years. One could, for example, point to ancient army messengers who took news of battles back to their leaders as an early kind of war correspondent. But it wasn't until the rise of newspapers that war correspondents as we think of them today came into being.
第二部分我们看到形容词 noble， 它的意思是崇高的或是高尚的。例如 Eliminating world hunger is a noble goal. 消灭全球的饥饿是个崇高的目标。又或者说 The king has a noble heart and cares deeply for his people. 那位国王有颗高尚的心，且非常关心他的人民。再来我们看到名词 messenger， 它的意思是军队传令员、信使或是送信人。例如 The messenger ran as fast as he could to deliver the news to the general. 那名传令兵尽快跑去把消息传给将军。又或者说 The messenger delivered the good news to us. 那位信使传递这个好消息给我们。
So now we're going to look at the history or the origins of the profession of war correspondent. It says here, the roots of this noble profession go back thousands of years. The phrase noble profession refers to being a war correspondent. Now, a profession is basically a job. It's something that one does professionally, that one does for a living. And this job or this profession is described as being noble. Now, something that's noble is admirable, but it's admirable for a particular reason. It's admirable because it's based on particularly high moral principles. So it's not the same as admiring somebody because they have an expensive car or because they are very beautiful externally. You admire them because they uphold moral values. They do something that's heroic or that other people can't do because they don't have those same qualities.
Right, so maybe somebody wants to become a nurse. They're going to nursing school because they want to help people. Well, that's a very noble ambition. Of course, if you get into nursing, you're not going to make a ton of money. You should, but a lot of people do it because they just want to help people out. And of course, this is a noble profession here of being a reporter or a war correspondent. A profession, again, is a job that pays you quite well, or pays you enough, I suppose, after a certain amount of training from university or technical school or whatever. And the roots of this go back thousands of years. We've had war correspondents for many centuries.
Yes, one could, for example, point to ancient army messengers who took news of battles back to their leaders as an early kind of war correspondent. So even though we associate war correspondence with something quite modern, something that is associated with television and newspapers, but you can find an example of a war correspondent in ancient times, because in ancient times, the army had messengers. So messengers were people who took messages and conveyed them from one person to another. So for instance, if a general in the battlefield wanted to report back to somebody and say, we need more soldiers, then they might use the messenger and give the messenger this message to take back to whoever is the receiver of the message. And this messenger's job is to convey information, convey news, and this person could be considered the first or prototypical war correspondent.
Right, so if you're looking for an example of early reporters or early war correspondents, you could indicate or you could point to these ancient army messengers, and they would take news of battles back to their leaders, and that would be an early kind of war correspondent. Okay, so that's an example there. They weren't working for newspapers, but they were getting information from the battlefield. They were risking their lives to get that information, and then they would go back to the leaders back at headquarters and tell them what was going on so that the generals could make some decisions on where to move troops and things like that. And yes, indeed, you could indicate that that was an early kind of war correspondent, but it wasn't until the rise of newspapers that war correspondents, as we think of them today, came into being. So we have the rise of newspapers. Newspapers and websites have not been around forever. Eventually, in the past, people started reading newspapers and they wanted to get some information. And if a war was going on, readers in London or New York or wherever wanted news of a conflict going on. And therefore, we had to have war correspondents going to those places to get that information.
That's right. So these war correspondents would be in the battlefield or very close to the soldiers who are fighting, and they would observe and write down what they saw, and what they wrote down would be sent back to headquarters and printed out as articles.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's go on now to the third part and talk about the history of war correspondence.
Arguably, the first war correspondent in the modern sense was a reporter named John Bell, who in 1794 followed a British army force during their many battles against the French. His aim was to send his newspaper, the London Oracle, a regular and faithful diary of events that might be of interest to its readers. I shall write, he stated, frequently in the field or under the first hedge that affords me safe retreat. And in fact, this mission statement would likely sound very familiar to any war correspondent working today.
第三部分介绍副词 arguably。这个字的意思是可能、可以说或是可论证的。例如 Ellen is arguably the smartest student in her class, but she doesn't like to brag about it. Ellen 可以说是我们班上最聪明的学生，但她不喜欢吹嘘这一点。或是 This is arguably the most delicious apple pie I've ever eaten. 这可以说是我吃过最好吃的苹果派。接下来我们来介绍形容词 faithful。它的意思是叙述或是抄本等如实的，也可以是忠实的或是忠诚的。例如 This painting is a faithful reproduction of the Queen's appearance. 这幅画如实再现女王的外貌。又或者说 When he retired, the basketball player thanked his faithful fans. 那位篮球选手退休时，感谢他的忠实球迷。最后我们看到名词 hedge， 它的意思是树篱。例如 The hedges in the garden are the same height as I am. 那个花园里的树篱跟我一样高。又或者说 My grandfather trimmed the hedge on the weekend. 我的爷爷在周末修剪了树篱。
Arguably, the first war correspondent in the modern sense was a reporter named John Bell, who in 1794 followed a British army force during their many battles against the French. So before we talked about ancient messengers as being considered the very first war correspondents, but now we're going to look at somebody who can be considered the very first actual war correspondent, a modern person. And he is arguably the first war correspondent in the modern sense. You can use the word arguably when you're stating your opinion or belief, and you want to give it more authority. So you're saying, this isn't just my opinion, but a lot of people think this way. It can be argued that the first war correspondent, in the modern sense, was a reporter named John Bell.
But somebody else may think of somebody else as being the first war correspondent, but still we've got enough information to actually say that John Bell was probably the first modern war correspondent, and in the year 1794 he followed a British army force during their many battles against the French. Of course, 1794 was about the time of the French Revolution, and we've got a British army force fighting against the French. We could say the British Army, but that would be the entire army. So a British army force would be a portion of the army. It would be soldiers who have the ability to inflict damage on the enemy. And of course, the British had lots of battles against the French. The French and the British were fighting quite a bit over history. And here his aim, or his goal, John Bell's goal, was to send his newspaper, the London Oracle, a regular and faithful diary of events that might be of interest to its readers. So he was a war correspondent for his newspaper, the London Oracle, that had a lot of readers, and of course he wanted to provide that newspaper with information about the war to give them a regular and faithful diary of events that might be of interest to the readers. So if something's faithful, that means it's trying to be as truthful as possible. They're not just making up a bunch of stuff.
Right. So faithful could mean truthful, and it could be true and trustworthy. And when you're a reporter, you do want to give a faithful account of things. You don't want to make up stories because you're there to report the truth and not to tell a story to your readers. And his goal, John Bell's goal, is to offer a regular and faithful diary. A diary would be a daily account of what happened, and the diary was about the events that might be of interest to its readers. So he didn't want to just write about anything, but he wrote on topics that he thought the readers of the London Oracle would be interested in.
Right, so if something's of interest to someone, that means you would be interested in that thing. For example, my wife told me about a lecture concerning the history of the Confucius Temple in Taipei. She said, hey, this might be of interest to you. You might be interested in checking out this lecture. And the reporter wanted to give information to the readers who might have some interest in this particular topic. These events would be of interest to the readers of the London Oracle. And he went on to say, I shall write, he stated, frequently in the field or under the first hedge that affords me safe retreat. So that's how he's writing here. He's in the field, in the battlefield. And, of course, he needs to find some protection, so he would be under the first hedge, which is a long line of bushes or shrubs or short trees, and that would afford him or offer him a safe retreat. Retreat would be some place to be protected.
Right. Here, the word hedge does refer to a line of bushes. Say, you can talk about the hedges of a garden or a backyard. But hedge can also mean something that protects you from something that's unpleasant. So when you invest money, you may want to prevent yourself from losing a lot of money. So you want to hedge your investments. That, of course, is being used as a verb and not a noun. But the idea is there. It's the same. It's some kind of protection.
Okay, so he's looking for some protection there, but he's still trying to get the information, and he wants to provide it to his newspaper so they can provide that information to its readers. And in fact, this mission statement would likely sound very familiar to any war correspondent working today. So even though John Bell was writing this way back in 1794, give or take a couple of years, we could still hear reporters probably have this as their mission statement. Yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to put myself in danger in order to provide this information to our dear readers or listeners or viewers, depending on the type of media they're using. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today, but we still need to hear once more from Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分的最后一句写到 It wasn't until the rise of newspapers that war correspondents as we think of them today came into being. 那这个句子它是用分列句来强调 not until the rise of newspapers 来表达说直到报纸兴起，我们今天所知的战地记者才开始存在。好，那我们这边就先来复习一下分列句还有 not until 点点点的用法。首先呢，我们用 it is 点点点 that 点点点，或者是用 it was 点点点 that 点点点，这样是分列句的句型，可以用来强调句中的某部分。那它的用法是把你原本句子要强调的部分摆在 it is 和 that 之间，或是 it was 和 that 之间，然后把原本句子里面剩下的字词就丢到 that 之后。所以呢，句型就是 it is 或 it was 加强调的部分，加 that 再加句子其他部分。第二个复习的是 not until 点点点，是表达直到点点点才怎么样。那么后面可以接表示时间点的名词或子句。好，那现在我们就要结合这两个重点咯。我们用 not until 加上名词或子句，用这部分来当做分列句要强调的部分，所以句型就会变成 it is 或是 it was 加上 not until 名词或子句加上 that再加句子其他部分，去强调说直到某个时间点才怎么样。例如 I didn't get his message until this morning. 那我们现在要把这个 not until this morning 来当做分列句强调的部分，是不是就会变成 It was not until this morning that 再加句子其他部分。那其他部分剩下 I did get his message， 我们就看到啦，这时候助动词 did 已经没有存在的必要，所以我们就把 did 拿掉，然后 get 要改成过去式哦，所以句子会变成 It wasn't until this morning that I got his message， 直到今天早上我才收到他的讯息。好，我们再造个例句 It wasn't until she graduated from college that she decided to pursue a career in music. 直到大学毕业，她才决定从事音乐事业。我们这边就是在强调 not until she graduated from college， 直到她大学毕业才怎么样怎么样。好，那课文第三部分有提到 John Bell 这位记者，有一句就写到说，他的目标是向他的报社伦敦预言报来发送一份定期且如实的日志，记录那些读者可能感兴趣的事件。文中是用 events that might be of interest to its readers 来表达读者可能感兴趣的事件。那 be of interest 意思就相当于 be interesting， 用来描述有趣的。我们这边就是要介绍of 加上抽象名词，那就是当形容词用，可以描述什么什么的，那可以摆在 be 动词后面来当补语。这个抽象名词的前方还可以加上 great, such, no 等等形容词来修饰，去加强语气。像 be of no use 就是 be not useful 没用的， be of great importance 就是 be very important非常重要的。好，举例来说 The project is of great importance， 这个专案很重要。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天的单字吧。
Correspondent. The news correspondent reported live on the politician's speech.
Noble. Omar's immediate offer to provide help showed his noble character. Profession. Becoming a member of the medical profession requires years of study and training. Messenger. A messenger arrived at the castle with important news for the king. Faithful. Cindy's faithful copy of the famous painting captured even the smallest details. Retreat. As the storm started, the people at the barbecue made a retreat to the house to find shelter.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoy reading along with us. I am Helen.
I am Roger.
See you next time.